Welcome to Ethiopia Today. This channel is the product of our love for Ethiopia and its people. We are so grateful for having great fans just like you behind us to achieve our mission for Ethiopia together. Many thanks. Today we will be presenting an article on the TPLF's 3,500 intellectuals. The article has highlighted important points and passed our team's review test. So we wanted to share with you, our followers, and invite you to stay tuned till the end to get the full messages. Let's get straight into the article. The TPLF's 3,500 intellectuals. Intellectuals are supposed to be men of great knowledge. An intellectual possesses the ability to think in a logical manner. An intellectual is guided by his own consciousness and knowledge, by means of independent research output and not by emotions. An intellectual is an independent thinker, who is capable of thinking outside the box, takes pleasure in serious study and thought, and is constantly critical of the information he or she receives, with the sole intention of defending a concrete proposition or to denounce an injustice. To be called a scholar and a professional, one needs to be governed and guided by the code of ethics of that profession or defending a system of values. One wonders how on earth the Tigray Liberation Front TPLF managed to create a bunch of zombie scholars and professionals thinking and acting in the same way as their creators, devoid of a gram of common sense. They do not seem to have an iota of elements that takes to become intellectuals. They are like drones, distance operated by remote control by the TPLF. They are programmed like robots, behaving in the way that the TPLF wanted them to behave. Just like the North Koreans are conditioned to blindly follow the Kim Il-sung dynasty, so do the predominant Tigray and the so-called intellectuals obtain their directions from the TPLF. They are the TPLF worshippers, devoid of their own thoughts and moral compass. When the TPLF was beating the war drum in 2020, mothers in tears from all over Ethiopia traveled to Tigray, going on their knees, begged to Brazil the president of the Tigray region to avoid war and resolve the issues Tigray had with the central government in a peaceful manner. The president ignored them. A team of elders, including the Olympic legend Haile Gebrselassie and religious leaders, also traveled to Tigray to convince the authorities of Tigray to avert war, but that the TPLF ignored them too. Overconfidence or deceit is as dangerous as losing confidence. Many mistakenly hoped that the Tigray intellectuals would talk the TPLF out of their nightmarish madness. Instead, they became their animals of burden, soon beating the war drums in chorus. Journalist Ababach Karsai raised her observation of the role of Tigray scholars and professionals to avoid the war with amazement. The TPLF invited so-called Tigray intellectuals and professionals from all over the world to lecture down to them what they were going to do with the Abiy government in their bravado quest to dismantle Ethiopia and build the great Republic of Tigray. The team of Tigray intellectuals included within them PhD, master's degree holders, doctors, engineers, you name it. Among them, one brave intellectual questioned the possible negative consequence of starting the war with the federal government on Tigray and proposed to settle the differences through peaceful means. His fear was that if the TPLF started the war, Abiy's government might cut off electricity, telephone, transport and other utilities, putting Tigray in the dark. Then one of the veterans, Tigadali, known by her nom de guerre Mongerino Fatli Work Gebra Xiabia, barked back at the inquisitor with such authority, "If Mekele would be in the dark, just for one night, do you think Addis Ababa would be in the light? If that happens, then we should be considered dead." That would never ever happen. The Tigrayan intellectual coiled back with shame for undermining the TPLF and resorted to dancing to their tune. That is why we say overconfidence is as dangerous as losing confidence. While the TPLF was massacring civilians, raping, looting, destroying infrastructure in Afar and in Amhara from northern Wello to northern Shua, the Global Society of Tigray Scholars and Professionals GSTS came up with a 7-point position. In those 7 points, they were lamenting that a genocide has been committed against the people of Tigray, which the United Nations did not find a shred of evidence such a crime was committed against the civilians on purpose. The genociders were crying genocide on Tigray to obscure their own crime on Amhara's Mai Kadra, Shen, Hake, Kombolcha, Dessie, Lalabella, Northern Shua, on Afar, at Gallicoma and Chifra. In fact, the term genocide has become a national hymn of the TPLF, which they have been dancing to that tune since 2005 when they stole electoral ballots and gunned down hundreds of protesters on the streets of Addis Ababa. They introduced for the first time the term Interhamwe in Ethiopia, which forced Ethiopian intellectuals to run to Google to find out what that term was exactly meant. Anyway, the so-called Tigrayan scholars and professionals almost demanded the Amhara and the Afars to surrender at their sixth position point. They demanded to lay their arms while they were fighting, looting and raping. Expect more surprises from Tigray intellectuals. The purpose of this article is to expose the extent of ignorance of the so-called Tigray intellectuals thinking in line with the TPLF leadership. To the amazement of millions of people across the world, the Global Society of Tigray Scholars and Professionals GSTS, which claims to have more than 3,500 members, recently surprised us on Twitter with position statement on the vital interest of Tigray, which includes 3 statements. Position 3E is the most bizarre statement. It reads, "Equally essential and related to the territorial integrity of Tigray is access to international borders and the right of access to and from the sea and freedom of transit as provided in Article 125 of the Law of the Sea. These constitutional and international rights are non-negotiable vital interest of Tigray." Doesn't that sound like putting the cart before the horse? There is an adage in the Ethiopian proverb, "Let the common diker be meat first." These guys have no clue that Tigray has been an integral part of Ethiopia for thousands of years and remains a territory of Ethiopia up until now. The border of Tigray is determined by the Ethiopian government and not by the United Nations or anybody else outside Ethiopia, as a matter of fact. This is common sense. These guys act as if Tigray is an independent country. The TPLF is not in charge of the government of Ethiopia anymore if they have forgotten to determine the future of Ethiopia. Even if they manage to defeat the government forces and control Tigray, the road to independence is bumpy and complicated as long as they wouldn't overthrow the federal government and regain power. For example, look at Abkhazia, Somaliland, and the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus. They have been de facto states for several decades now, but they are not recognized by the United Nations because they couldn't obtain recognition from the governments of the countries they were trying to break away from. Therefore, the Tigrayan intellectuals must wake up and smell the coffee before talking about the international border or an outlet to the sea. They have no legal or moral authority to demand that. Only the Ethiopian government decides what to do with them, as Tigray is in Ethiopia and Tigrayans are Ethiopians throughout the existence of Ethiopia for thousands of years. They need to swallow the bitter pill. There must be more than 3,500 Tigrayan seasoned intellectuals, perhaps in the tens of thousands. However, their silence makes them just as guilty as the 3,500 clueless scholars and professionals as they are representing them. The red area within the map of Ethiopia is the historical map of Tigray, excluding the lands of Amhara forcefully annexed 30 years ago. The land annexed after 1991 is now back to their ancestral roots after the greedy and expansionist TPLF imposed war on the Ethiopian government. On the 3rd of November, the TPLF made a terrible mistake of starting the war they had been preparing for 2 years. An Amharic saying comes to mind: "One who doesn't know when full spends the night getting sick." 6 days after the started war, realizing they were losing, on the 9th of November 2020 the TPLF soldiers started going from house to house and began massacring Wolkate Amharas. Within a matter of hours, they hacked down 1,100 Amharas at Maikadra, Machena, 2020, with the intention of cleansing hundreds of thousands of civilian indigenous Amhara from Wolkate, Tegadi and Humera. Luckily, the arrival of the Amhara militia and Fano just in time stopped the massacre, forcing the murderers to flee. The genociders crossed the border into Sudan, from where they are now attempting incursion to come back. Incidentally, they have now burned down the UN refugee camp in Sudan and fully moved to training military camp, sponsored by the Egyptian and Sudanese governments. Therefore the struggle of Tigrayan elites to get back Woolkate, Tigray and Hermela is a moot case to get access to Sudan. What access to the international border are they talking about? They should learn the history Lesotho and Kingdom of Swaziland, which are surrounded by South Africa and landlocked. This group of the so-called Tigrayan intellectuals had completely forgotten how their leadership persecuted Ethiopian intellectuals such as Haile Mariam Karsai, who are demanding the right of Ethiopia to the sea outlet based on the very Article 125 of United Nations, that she lost in 1991 when the TPLF came to power. The Tigrayan scholars and professionals were vilifying them then. Now the same intellectuals are demanding for the tiny renegade province of Ethiopia, Tigray, to have an international border and sea outlet which they denied to the bigger Ethiopia for 27 years. Do they know what shame means? Is that reason why they invaded Afar, to incorporate into Tigray? Still, had they succeeded in defeating the Afars, they need either to defeat Eritrea to grab port of Assab or invade and defeat Djibouti to annex the port and incorporate it into Greater Tigray. Tigrayan intellectual daydreamers are devoid of intellectual common sense, blinded by TPLF propaganda, and make themselves a laughingstock. Let the so-called Tigray scholars and professionals understand this. There is no international law that would take land from an independent country to let a province of a country have a sea outlet. No one has the right to award Assab to Tigray or no legal means to allow them to annex Djibouti. As for the international borders, if Tigray remains an integral part of Ethiopia, they will never ever have the legal power to claim any of those demands because the internal territory is defined by the authorities of Ethiopia and not an international body. There is an international law that prohibits interference in the internal affairs of any country. Ethiopia is not an exception. If they succeed to become independent, then Eritrea and Ethiopia will be their international borders. There they would have the international borders. What is the fuss? In 1991, when the TPLF became the government of Ethiopia, they took by force the historical territory of Gondar province, Woolkate, Tigray and Hermela, incorporating it into Tigray so that Tigray would stretch to the border with Sudan. However, for 27 years, the people of Woolkate and Hermela were fighting for their rights, demanding to be back with their natural blood relatives, the Amhara. The residents have gone through ethnic cleansing and suffered linguistic and cultural genocide. It is a different time now. The dream of Woolkites became the reality when the TPLF deliberately started the war and got kicked out of Woolkate, Tigray, Hermela and Raya. Without violating international law, no power under the sun has the right to reverse that. They have lost. They need to face the reality. Just to serve the interest of the TPLF, the people of Tigray should not be subjected to more suffering. The criminals need to be apprehended. The Tigray intellectuals need to save their place in history by trying sense to the TPLF rather than being considered ordinary cadres of the war criminals. Case closed. By Wundimu Mekonnen. We hope you got valuable information. Thanks again. If you enjoyed our presentation, give us a like and share to your social contacts. And also don't forget to subscribe and hit on notification bell if this is your first time. By doing so, you are helping this channel to continue producing this and similar news. Many thanks. May God bless Ethiopia and its people.